Okay, class. Um, Picking up where we left off, our last class is on Japan and some of the mental health struggles that Japan was facing, given just the extraordinary cultural work ethic in Japan, the expectation that you devote yourself first and foremost to your company, to work itself, to never being the first person that leaves the office, to finding a big part of your identity in your work. That ethos, that culture for 3 generations took Japan from complete destitution and destruction after World War II to one of the top 3 wealthiest countries on the planet. And maybe very few countries have ever gone from such poverty to such wealth and such broad-based wealth, and a lot of equality overall. It's one of the rare instances of that. So these 2 classes on Japan, on public health policy, mental health, aging, that we're going to focus on today, they're both permeated with a sense of real respect for what Japan's accomplished and how much wealth they have created for their people. So put a pin in that. That's huge and that's remarkable. What makes Japan really interesting then is, what do you do when you've climbed the mountain? What do you do when you've actually achieved any country's goal, which is to become wealthy? What then? What next? And what if what got you there to the top took such sacrifice of enjoying life, of the things that get you up Maslow's hierarchy? What happens if delaying that, sacrificing that for economic prosperity? What happens if at a certain point it starts to take a collective toll on people, and younger generations start to find that cultural norms and the ethos that got their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and their parents to the top isn't really sustainable for more and more young Japanese? And that's what you'll find in the materials that we covered today. So again, I want to just take a shout out to the incredible accomplishment that Japan is. It's wealthy. Its people have the longest life expectancy on the planet, upward, getting close to 90 as the average, like the middle of the bell curve, meaning more like it's getting to the point that people born today in Japan, their life expectancy will be 100. Lowest obesity rates, really good health system, overall impressive and admirable relative equality, or I should say, Japan doesn't have the huge levels of inequality that you see in places like the United States, now China and South Africa. So many things to admire. This is like a country that does so many things right for so many decades, that people live long and relatively healthy and relatively, lower rates of poverty and so much success. So it's incredible. It's like you could spend a whole semester like, how did they do that? And what were the components of it? And how much can that be replicated? And look at, here's the ultimate proof. Japanese live long. They live the longest. And the proportion of the population in Japan that is over age 65 is the highest of any country on the planet, 23%, by a quarter. At this point, it's by a quarter, on the way to being, in the not too distant future, like 2030, 2040, 40% of the population will be over 65. That is a triumph in many ways. That's people not dying younger means they've lived longer, richer lives. The challenge now, if you follow this in Japan, is how do you manage large numbers of people, really large numbers of people, a huge proportion of your population, semi-retired, fully retired, aging, they don't have a lot of children, so who's going to take care of them? How are they going to deal with the isolation? And you can see relatively few people in Africa over 60, but look at Japan, Italy, Germany. US would be up here closer to Germany and Italy, except that we have really high levels of immigration. Lots of people want to come to the US, and I know that's a point of contention. It's a real huge point of contention. It gave a lot of Trump, a lot of his supporters are people who are not keen on that. And we can have we'll talk about that more in this class. We'll have a whole 2 classes on immigration policy. But one thing you can say is it keeps our population stable. It brings in a lot of economic stimulus and a lot of creativity and innovation and vibrancy to our economy, to our culture, comes from immigration. Japan has very little immigration. They've had to increase a lot of guest worker visas for people to come work from the Philippines, South Korea, and mostly Japan and China. But it's done with a lot of reluctance, a lot of cultural resistance. And so Japan doesn't get to harness a lot of new ideas, a lot of new vibrant workers the way the United States does. And so just look at this graph for a second. This is the working age population, but it's also the same graph of what Japan's population is going to do. Japan's total population is 126 million. Its total population will begin to, it's already in the process of going down by 1 million or 2 every year. So in 40 years, 50 years, they're going to go from a population of 126 million to 80 million and even less. And that's the working population plummeting, absolutely plummeting. Again, low birth rate, minimal immigration means that over time, you have way more deaths than births. Your country is shrinking. This is Japan in the 1950s, like all countries, it's a pyramid, lots of youth, not as much in the middle age and not many old people at all, which is problematic because younger than 20-somethings, kids, teenagers, they cost more than they generate in revenue. And so you need to invest in this population. Ideal population looks like this, big, broad, middle of 20 to 60-year-olds, working, paying taxes, saving, fueling the economy, taking care of the kids they have, taking care of a manageable level of older people. By 2055, it's going to be not many kids because everybody's having one child or no children, and thinned out middle and a big, huge elderly population over the age of 65. Some of them working part-time, but north of 80, not working very much. Higher rates of dementia, higher rates of dependency, Social Security, healthcare. It's a real policy challenge. How do you manage all that wealth when the wealth starts to translate into lots of old retired people? You can look at the aging population. By 2050, you're coming close to not quite half, but a solid 1/3 to 40% of the population over the age of 64. And it's really extraordinary. It's extraordinary, and also it's fascinating because Japan's going to be forced to figure out, what do you do with so many old people? How do you manage their living? How do you manage their healthcare? How do you manage their mental health? How do you manage their isolation, right? One of the areas that they're pioneering in is robotics. And you can click on these videos and you can see Japan's incredible innovation with robots that can deliver things, pick things up. They have robots that are like pets. They have seals, dogs, and cats. They have, it can almost be, if you're not familiar with this, it can be a little creepy because the purpose of some of these robots is to simulate human interaction or an animal interaction like a pet, but of course they're robots. But if you more and more people who are over the age of 85 with dementia, they don't know. And so is that kind of crossing an ethical boundary that you're giving them an animatronic pet that does keep them soothed, that kind of keeps them content, that allows them to use less psychiatric medications, anxiety medications, antipsychotics? Well, that sounds good. But gosh, do you really want to spend years or decades of your life as an individual getting this excited about a robot? It raises a lot of ethical issues. And another one that's more economic and just demographic is dependency ratios. And it's the number of people age 65 and older per 100 people. Well, this is where it is right now, 2015, or right around here. And then, you can look at Greece, Italy, Germany's, it's not going to be as advanced, but you're getting, like, by 2050, you're not quite a 1-to-1 ratio, but you're on the trajectory of having one person over the age of 64 for every, person, ages 20 to 64 in the workforce. Never had that. That's a real accomplishment to get to that point. And yet it's going to be an accomplishment that's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on Japanese society to pay for that and to just manage the human components of that. And so this is the replacement fertility level ratio right here, about 2.1 kids per woman. And then on the x-axis here is just how rich is that country. And you can see what naturally happens to wealthy countries over time is they just have less and less children. And that's actually really good from an environmental standpoint. Less human beings is great for the environment. But our society is not designed to die off. Our society is not designed for the workforce to shrink. and for the economy to slow so significantly when you have less people working and innovating and creating new things, the economy shrinks. Our whole paradigm is built on continued economic growth and more in the 3 to 4 to 5, maybe even higher percent range every year. And these countries are starting to experience, and even China is starting to see economic slowdowns. They're still growing every year, but not at the rate they used to be. And Japan has grown at the average rate of about 1% since the 1990s per year, 1%. So, and that's also leading to more debt. Japan has to go into more debt to pay for its society. So why are Japanese people having fewer and fewer babies? Well, one of the factors is, going back to that work ethic, Japanese make the United States workforce look relaxed. They average 49 to 50 hours a week of work plus 100 hours of overtime per month. So they're working basically 50 hours a week and then 15 to 20 hours a week overtime. And so even the good jobs, the good ones that pay enough to have a home and a family, the people are working so much. They're such workaholics in a sense. That's the culture, it's being a workaholic. Well, that's not conducive to having a robust family life and a robust, marriage and the things that are really important for Japanese culture to have a family. This is a really important element of this. Only 2% of Japanese children are born outside marriage, compared with over 40% in Britain and America. This is a huge contributing factor to why there are so many more deaths than births in Japan. You have lower rates of marriage in Japan because people are working more and committing more, especially women who are making progress in the professional workforce. Their careers are developing at a better rate than they have traditionally, when women in Japan tend to be more housewives. Now, the Japanese women are entering the workforce in the last 2 generations at much greater, higher rates, which is great. And if that's their choice, that's awesome. And that's been a big goal of Japan, is to open up professional opportunities for women to do what they want to do. Excellent. But as they commit more to the workforce, they marry less. And if you only have 2% of Japanese children born outside of marriage, you also have a lot fewer births. So the trade-off is greater economic entry, greater equality in the professions. Women can do more, awesome. But unless they change part of their culture to make it also more conducive to having a robust personal life, work-life balance, then fewer people get married. And then because of that, there are just fewer births. And another cultural lag in Japan, if you read these articles and documentaries and reports, is that the Japanese government for many years has encouraged more women to enter the workforce and for more equality and better pay equality. And that has resulted, you've seen this in Japan, for more women in the workforce. What hasn't changed is this huge cultural lag, is the reality that more Japanese women still have to do the vast majority of the housework, 90%. And so you can see younger women in Japan are looking at all of this and saying, so I have to work harder. There are still glass ceilings that I can't get to the top levels, and so I keep working harder. And then I don't have time to get married. And even if I do find the time to get married, that just involves more work. Now I got to do more domestic work. And you can see that younger Japanese women are just saying, I can figure this out. I can see that this doesn't work. And this is a story about a Japanese woman during COVID who just now her husband was at home and she's expecting him to do more of the housework and he's not inclined to do it. And she's working and he's working. So he makes a list of all the things he does on the home front, thinking that's going to end the discussion. And she's like, well, excuse me, here's my list, page 1, and my list, page 2. So let me show you how this plays out. This is really, really interesting. And this is a journalist. It's a great 4-part series done clearly in anticipation of the Olympics to help people learn more about Japan. But it's just an interesting seminar for Japanese professional women who are going into the workforce, but also want to figure out how to try to manage that work-life marriage balance. How do you abide by the cultural norms of what Japanese men want in a wife? And you can just see the collision of the older order of Japanese women who were pretty much stayed at home and were housewives and found fulfillment in that. And they're trying to teach a younger generation of Japanese women how to reconcile their professional lives to these older norms of being a housewife.
ここに来て、そして皆さんもちょっと前のめりになります。だから前のめりになれば、うちの奥さんって何でこうやって話を聞いてくれるんだな、素敵だなってそういうことを思うんですね。
The modern term for wife, okusama, essentially means the inside person. Adachi-san has plenty of tips for one who aspires to be a housewife.
私の母はですね、家の仕事ができる女性は何でもできるってよく言いました。仕事もできるし、遊ぶこともできるし、それができない人というのは本当は仕事もできなかったりするんです。
There are prescribed rules for women to follow for every little task.
立つ時には必ず手は前に揃えます。これはあなたに従いますよというそういう意味合いがあります。
From seeing your husband off in the morning.
ね、さよなら、いってらっしゃい。これは無事に帰ってきてねという、あなた無事に帰ってきてね。
To non-verbal cues you should use.
実は顔の脇で振るといいんですよ。可愛く見えます。はい、笑顔でね。とっても可愛いわ。振ってもそうやって振ってもらったらね、今日も一日頑張ろうってそういう気持ちになりますよね。はい。こんばんは。
There's even a proper way to kneel on cushions.
座り方としてはねじっていきます。ちょっと前に、はい、ねじるっていうのはこれパーじゃなくてグーにしていただいて、ここにそうです、こうやってよいしょよいしょと、はい、じゃあどうぞ皆さん
To greeting guests.
今日はありがとうございました言って、はい、帰ります。
There are even rules on how to open traditional Japanese doors.
近い手でちょっと開けます。で、滑らせていって半分まで開けます。そして手を変えて、で、向こうにお客様がいたら、はい、どうぞ。
Of course, she picked me to demonstrate.
じゃあ、失礼します。はい。そうです、そうです。はい。これ2回で閉めました、今。はい。2回です。3回です。
I'm never getting this right.
もう一回お願いします。厳しいんです、先生。はい、どうぞ。ここです。そうです、そうです。はい、そうです。ありがとうございます。
After a grueling 3 hours, we finally complete the course.
今ね、女性が働く、私は一番楽しい時間は、育児をしてる時が一番楽しかったです。でもそういうとても楽しいひとときがあったなっていうことが思い出されるのがとても嬉しく思っています。なのでぜひね、皆さんも自分の未来を考えて、そして働きながらも楽しみをたくさん持っていただきたいと思います。
A lot of what the women were talking about in the seminar may seem like empowerment on its face, but was really imbued with the patriarchy.
これを言うとまた、パワハラと言われてしまうかもしれないんですけれども、日本人っていうのはもともと男、ね、男性を女性が支えるもの、男は守るものっていうような形で来たんですね。
私の印象の中ではそれってなんて言うんでしょう、女性の方を潰してるというか、その声を引かしてるっていう、感覚もあると思うんですけれど、そういう面では
どこまで出たらいいのかっていうことなんですね。私がってことではなくて、日本女性というのは出るとこは出る、だけど引くとこは引くっていうその駆け引きですか。
なるほど、はい、今の日本の、若い女性の中でこれが一番ちょっと足りてないなとか欠けてるなっていうのはどうなんでしょう。
仕草だと思います。椅子に座るにしても足をパカッと開いて座ってしまったり、もう平気で地べたに座ってしまったり、そういうことが恥ずかしいと思わない日本女性が多くいるのかなと思うことは非常に心寂しいことだと思います。
これで2回撮ります。はい、ポーズ。
This was the first time the event actually exceeded exactly the vision that I had for it. It was almost like a textbook example of what a seminar about what it means to be a a true Japanese lady. It's still steeped into the idea that the man is still the head of the household, and therefore there's certain rules that you need to follow. A lot of the skills and tips that were taught were mainly to make sure that your husband or your partner, the man, is pleased. Learning these rules from a mother figure like Adachi-san perpetuates these cultural checks and balances on how a woman should conduct herself, which I found was pretty disappointing. It continues to transmit to women that they are supposed to be dainty, quiet, and obedient. Ultimately, be less than their male counterparts. For so long, a woman's worth has been measured by marriage, but there are signs that this is changing. A government census from the 90s found that 1 in 20 women had never been married. That number has increased to 1 in 7 today. I want to find out more about these women who opt out. So I arrange a date with some perfectly single ladies.
So it's a really great series, and I highly recommend that you, if and when you ever have the chance to watch it in its entirety, it's phenomenal. And I'll just tell you really quickly, she meets with 2 young 30-something professional Japanese women who very clearly outline sort of the impossible tension between advancing professionally, which requires extraordinary amount of time commitment, and also just mental commitment, emotional commitment, and how incompatible that is with even finding a spouse, much less then, on top of that, raising a child. You see this a lot in Japan, a child, an only child, maybe 2 children. And you can see as they explain it when she interviews them, it's just almost overwhelming to try to do all of that, satisfy all of those expectations, and to do that as an individual. And that's why you see in the statistics, it used to be 1 in 20 women never got married, now it's 1 in 7. And it's part of that same trajectory of less marriage, and that also correlates directly to less children. And as an end result, more chance to work. But that comes at a toll. All of this comes at a cost. So if you can't reconcile all of it, in the end, people will make a choice. And in Japan, they're choosing more their career. That also results in, as we saw in our last class, Japan, if you think there's validity to these happiness rankings, and happiness is a function of a whole bunch of metrics: GDP per capita, social support in the form of healthcare, childcare, elder care, transportation, housing, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, which is philanthropy, absence of corruption. You smash all that together, you get the Scandinavian countries that limit the work week to like 36, 35 hours per week, plenty of time for other things, 6 weeks paid vacation. That's one model. Japan's another model. Japan's richer than the Scandinavian countries. Japan's a bigger economy. It's wealthier per capita. In that sense, I guess it's a more powerful country. But it's a different paradigm, and it's a different model of the approach to personal life versus your work life. And maybe in that partly explains why the United States is sort of in the middle, and then Japan, in terms of happiness, is of all the OECD countries, is the lowest. And so all of that in the end kind of goes back to the question we started with: is how do you then kind of manage, if you become one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, and that's so extraordinary and awesome, how do you then manage that? How do you manage it moving forward? How do you manage essentially also a decline in birth rates, decline in economic expansion? It's still only 1% a year. Decline in marriage, decline in happiness. Right? One of the things you can do is let in a lot more immigrants, but Japan is only going to do that grudgingly. And they are doing it. They are letting in more workers. They're not letting in more citizens, that's for sure. They're letting in more guest workers. And if you had a chance to watch this fascinating, by the way, this is another multi-part series I can't recommend highly enough, Black in Asia. One of the things that comes out in the first episode is this gentleman surveys, interviews a bunch of very successful Black people in Japan, China, Singapore, South Korea. The first thing you notice, and it kind of harkens back to Maslow's hierarchy, the thing they keep mentioning over and over again, besides the professional opportunities and the chance to do things that are different and new, and they all find that very appealing, the thing that every other person basically every single person in the interview says is that Black people feel safer in Japan. They feel safer in Japan than they do in the United States. They feel safer than they do in parts of Europe. That is such an interesting commentary on what it's like to live in the United States if you aren't necessarily white. And you don't always have that level of default safety that you feel. They feel safer in Japan. They feel safer in Asia. The door can be unlocked in Singapore, and they feel a lot safer there. They feel safer with the police in Asia than they do with the police in the United States, which after the events of the last couple of years is not surprising, but it's still an incredible commentary on what it's like to be Black in the United States, and how, if by looking at how it is to be Black in Asia, you get a real window into how it's like in Asia, but you also get a window back onto what it's like to be Black in the United States. It's not a compliment. Now, look at this. Population, the working age population 15 to 64 in Japan has plummeted. They have still managed to maintain high levels of overall employment two ways: letting in more guest workers, and people work longer. They pull people back out of retirement in Japan, and many people in Japan have pulled themselves out of retirement to be back in the workforce. Japan needs older people in the workforce. Many of these older workers need to keep working to pay their bills, and many of them, their identity is so wrapped up in their work, they really can't retire. There's nothing for them to do. So the percentage of workers 65 and older in the workforce has gone up. The number of workers 65 and older has continued to go up. This is how Japan manages its continued existence, but also its decline, is that you have older and older and older workers coming back into the workforce, never leaving the workforce, and then labor force participation highest. Ages 15 to 64 is highest, and then over 64, higher numbers of people in Japan working. Now, this all brings us back, as this class ends, to this issue of how do you manage what's going to happen to not just Japan, but to Germany, Italy, the United States, eventually all of these countries that get to a certain level of wealth. Population is going to shrink. People are going to have one child. An increasing proportion of people aren't going to have any children. And so all the wealthy countries are going to shrink in population in the future. Well, the answer is you can handle it better with public policy, or you can just not handle it at all, and it's going to be a complete disaster. Because look at this. Average population growth in the US is right behind Japan. The thing that keeps us from being Japan, the Japanification of the US, is forestalled because of immigration. One of the ways that and please click on this at the end, a different way of approaching economic policy and public policy is to get away from this fixation with just GDP growth. Are we growing 4% a year, 5% a year, 3%? If so, that solves all of our problems. If our economy contracts, that's calamitous. If we only manage 1%, that's not going to do it. We have to bow down and sacrifice everything to 2, 3, 4, ideally 4 or 5% GDP growth per year. Kate Rayworth is an economist that says, if you just fixate on growing economically in your GDP without any consideration for the environmental indicators, how your environment is doing, it's suicidal in the end to just grow at the expense of your environment. You have to balance meeting all these basic economic and personal needs. These are all Maslow's hierarchy needs here. You need that. We need that. But it can't come explicitly and then solely at the expense of our environment. You want to be in the middle here, this donut. This is the safe place to live, which is you do meet all these needs through the using of natural resources. We have to use natural resources for economic growth, to lower poverty, and to maintain our standard of living. But there has to be a balance, and you can do that. And there's one city that they're trying this out. It's Amsterdam. So if you get a chance to study abroad there, it's something to consider. Amsterdam is trying to find a way to holistically integrate not just 4% growth a year and then however that comes about, we don't care. It says we need to grow economically. We do need to use natural resources. We do need to grow, but we need to grow wisely. We need to grow in a way that's environmentally sustainable and is more equitable for all the people in Amsterdam. So that it's the 4% growth isn't just to the top 20% who could then afford the housing, and everyone else just scrambles and tries to keep up and can't. It's a really healthy way to look at changing the way we measure progress and success, and trying to find it in a more integrated, holistic way that is sustainable, that keeps our environment in a healthy position and actually makes it healthier, but also does it in recognition that people need these things. They need all the basics, but they also need political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing. They need enough income. That might mean a $15 an hour minimum wage or $20 like it is in Australia. Everybody needs to be educated and have access to health. And that these are the ways you measure how you're doing, not just to be making it to 4 or 5% GDP growth. Okay? So this will be a great segue then to China, because if Japan's managing its decline and it's already in a sense achieved superpower status and one of the top economies in the world, China is the next story where they're still climbing. Like they're in a more exciting stage of their development, which is they haven't gotten to the mountain yet like Japan has already accomplished. China's on the way there. And in the next 4, 5, 6 years, they're going to become the single largest economy on the planet, not per capita. I mean, it's still per person, they won't be the wealthiest. But China's overall economy will be bigger than the United States, bigger than Japan's, bigger than Germany's. And so it's going to be neat to study China as a country that is sort of like where Japan was 40 years ago. And they're going to try to figure out how to do the same thing as well. How do you keep growing so that you get more and more people out of poverty and the country becomes more powerful? But how do you do it in a way that is sustainable, equitable, and environmentally doable? Okay? All right, next class, China.